Hi everyone. This is going to be a quick put together recorded um, lecture on demography, urbanization, and the environment. So I'm going to go ahead and get started. Just a reminder that your discussion posts are due Tuesday, your replies are due on Thursday, and your quiz is due Friday. So let's talk a little bit more about demography. Demography is the study of populations, um, including things like the age of that population, where they live, whether they're more urbanized or living in more rural areas, whether that population is growing or declining, whether there's immigration, and other social problems related to these sorts of forces. Population growth and decline are impacted by things like fertility rates or birth rates, as well as the mortality rates or death rates. So, how many people are being born, how quickly people are being born, and how quickly people are dying, and at what age are they dying. Um, so, we're going to look at this next slide and show a short video, and I want you to think about what the what's going on in these graphs and what they mean. So, here we have. I'll start the video in a moment. Here we have a list of population, male and female, by age. So 0 to 4 all the way up to 100 plus, and then percentage of the population that is that age. So there's 4.7% of the population is under 4 if you're male, 4.4 is female, and this is for the world in 2017. So I'm going to let this play through and then we'll talk about it a little bit. And you'll notice that these different shapes indicate different patterns of demography, including differing birth rates, death rates, that sort of thing. Okay. So one thing to note here is that you'll notice that in a lot of more agricultural countries, there's going to be a lot more children being born. And usually this is because infant mortality rates are fairly high, and a higher population of children in your family means that you have more people to work on your farm or your area. But you also notice that some of the other countries, as they get wealthier, tend to get more even spreads, and that's because one, mortality rate decreases in more developed, advanced countries, so people live longer, but also that the birth rates decrease because the mortality rate for infants is also much lower. So some things to look at. There's a number of theories about demography, and the first one I want to touch on is Malthusian theory. And Malthusian theory is derived from the work of Thomas Malthus, and he argued that populations would grow and grow and grow kind of exponentially until they hit the Earth's carrying capacity. So in this case, be this point here. This is where Malthus thinks that there's going to be some sort of event that is going to cause some sort of disease, war, famine that is going to bring our population back under control. So here, this red line is our population. We're growing, growing, growing exponentially. Once we exceed the amount of resources or their carrying capacity represented by this black line, then there will be some sort of major crisis that will cause our population to drop below the Earth's carrying capacity. Malthus claimed that upon reaching this carrying capacity, there would be some sort of really violent, difficult, disruptive crisis, and he recommended a lot of population control measures, such as lowering fertility rates through birth control and celibacy, particularly for poor and working class women, of course. So, part of his argument was a little bit more eugenics-like, which was, not good. Malthus, however, has been proven largely incorrect, mostly because Malthus did not predict advances in agricultural, food production, healthcare, etc., that allowed our population to continue to increase despite reaching what he thought would be the carrying capacity. Similar arguments have been made more recently that environmental damage and global warming may yet prove Malthus right. So there's some arguments that are now saying that we might reach a point where the environmental damage and global warming may decrease Earth's carrying capacity, um, and that remains to be seen. Opposite of Malthus is the much more optimistic cornucopian theory, which argues that human ingenuity will eventually and somewhat inevitably solve any and all potential issues. And a lot of this comes from the fact that Malthus was wrong about poverty and the carrying capacity of Earth related to things like famine and running out of food supplies. Agricultural scientists have figured out and will figure out what to grow and how to grow the food that is needed, and climate scientists and other people will figure out how to prevent or adapt to climate change. Fairly optimistic, but a slightly different perspective here. Another theory of demography is the demographic transition theory that argues there are 4 stages to population growth. The first is unindustrialized, and again, this is where life is more agricultural, fertility rates are high, as are mortality rates, particularly for young children and infants. Life expectancy is short, but this is largely due to mortality rates among infants, right? If children are dying very young, that's going to bring down the overall average lifespan for everybody when you have really high infant mortality rates. And the second stage is industrializing. Birth rates remain high while infant mortality and overall death rates begin to decrease. This leads to a baby boom, right? Lots of babies being born because you're used to high infant mortality, so you have lots of kids. But at this time, these particularly infant mortality rates are declining, and so you have a lot of those babies surviving. And this will lead to a really high number of small children and a growing population. Industrialized, death rates continue to decline, but this time birth rates start to decline as well. So this is something that's been happening in places like the US, Japan, places like that, where because people have a much longer lifespan and child mortality is so much lower, people start having less kids. And then finally you have post-industrial. This is where birth and death rates are low, people are healthier and live longer, the population begins to stabilize. What we're seeing in a lot of countries now is actually kind of reverse of this stage 4, where yes, birth and death rates are low, people are healthier and living longer, but the population actually begins to decline because everything's so expensive. We see people not having kids or choosing to have a lot less kids. They're not having 2 kids, maybe they're only having 1 kid, and this is actually leading to a certain amount of population decline in some areas. And so let's talk about where people choose to live. We have a few different categories. We have rural areas, which are those smaller towns and villages in the country, in quotes, outside of the big cities and suburbs. We have urban areas where urbanization has occurred during industrialization as workers were needed for factories and jobs. And these jobs became much more available in the cities than they did in rural areas. And so we have urbanization. Those big cities like New York, Chicago, etc., are all great examples of this urbanization. Suburban areas are those areas outside of the city. So as cities grew larger and more crowded and became more and more impoverished through sometimes racialized laws, at least in the US, wealthier, and again generally whiter folks began moving just outside the cities to those previously rural towns, but begin developing them, and you get the suburbs like you see in the suburbs of Los Angeles. Orange County is almost itself just a giant suburb, but you have places like Riverside, Lancaster. Those areas are also considered suburbs. We also have the exurbs. As the suburbs become desegregated and more crowded, as that population continues to grow and the city gets larger and larger, and the kind of downtown central urbanized areas become larger, as LA grows and other things like that, wealthier people who can afford the commutes and want more space tend to move from the suburbs to even further out to what are called the exurbs. Examples could include parts of LA and Orange County that are extremely expensive, things like Beverly Hills, Malibu, Newport Coast, Laguna Beach, etc. Sometimes these places are not just necessarily wealthier or more costly than the suburbs, but instead provide a better cost of living comparatively. So, again, going back to our examples of Lancaster, Palmdale, you might be able to classify those as exurbs as well. They're really far removed from the urban center of Los Angeles and are considerably more cheap and considerably cheaper than Los Angeles and even the suburbs around Los Angeles. Suburban and exurban areas are typically created through white flight, as whites flee the area of the urban area towards whiter and wealthier areas. And a lot of these issues around segregation and suburbs and exurbs has to do with what is called redlining, which was a set of government-backed programs that gave preferential loans to whites and prevented people of color from getting these loans. And so how this contributes is that redlining allowed white people during the 40s, 50s, 60s, even into the 70s to get really good loans that allowed them to leave the urban areas and move to those suburbs and then eventually those exurbs. And that caused housing prices in those suburbs and exurbs to go up. And those suburbs and exurbs, because the housing prices are better than the urban areas that the whites fled from, therefore have more money for schools and better resources for their communities because there's more money in that community and those communities are wealthier. And this leads to this segregation where you have a lot of urban areas that are poorer, they are more prone to have people of color, and they tend to be more run down and have worse education, worse schools, more pollution, more environmental damage. While the suburbs tend to be wealthier, they tend to be whiter, they tend to have better schools, and they tend to have what is called more NIMBYism, right? Not in my backyard. And you end up with these kind of really the nice neighborhood versus the poor, bad neighborhood. And this has to do, again, with going back to these redlining. And most of these areas that have been redlined never really recovered. We still haven't seen a change that has allowed these areas to fully redevelop and kind of invigorate them so that they can be revitalized. Alright, so that was the lecture for today. Again, I'm sorry I missed this week. Hopefully this gives you a good idea of what we're talking about this week. And if you have any questions, feel free to let me know. Thank you.